In the mid-16th century, in the glorious Topkapi Palace of Istanbul, Sultan Suleiman and his wife Hurrem Sultan ruled one of the world's greatest empires together, side by side. Golden embroidered thrones, precious carpets, crystal chandeliers, every corner of this palace, filled with magnificence, hosted diplomatic feasts, splendid ceremonies, and state councils one after another. The heart of an empire spanning 3 continents beat here. However, at the same time during this very period, a day's horse journey away from Istanbul, in the quiet, peaceful streets of Bursa, an entirely different life was being lived. Here, in a modest house, a woman lived alone, Mahidevran Sultan, Suleiman's first favorite, his first and perhaps deepest love, and most importantly, the mother of his first son. This woman, who years ago in Manisa had been the brightest star of the palace, now lived in a simple house near her son's grave. Every morning when she woke up, she would open the wooden window shutters and immediately across, a few hundred steps away, she could see the white marble tomb of her son, Prince Mustafa. Every day the same pain, the same longing, the same silent lament. She would wake early in the mornings, perform ablution, and pray. Then she would go to the tomb. She would walk with slow steps, as if remembering a memory from the past with each step. She would enter through the tomb's door, sit by her son's grave, and pray for hours. Sometimes she would cry, sometimes she would sit silently, and sometimes she would talk about the past. Even though no one was listening, she would tell her son, little Mustafa's first steps, his first words, the day he started school, his first horseback ride. Then she would return home, perform the evening prayer, pray again, and sleep. The next day the same routine would begin again. But how did this woman's story begin? How did Mahidevran, who once seemed certain to become the most powerful woman of the empire, end up spending her days like this, alone, mourning her son? What exactly happened on the path from the glory of palaces, from the pinnacle of power, to this lonely seclusion? To find answers to these questions, we need to go back to what were perhaps the most magnificent, but also the bloodiest, most turbulent, most dramatic years of the Ottoman Empire. Our story begins in the early 1510s, in the city of Manisa, 2 days' horse journey from Istanbul. Manisa held a very special place in Ottoman tradition at that time. Princes, meaning the Sultan's sons, would be sent to provinces as governors when they reached a certain age. This was both for them to gain administrative experience and to prevent potential fraternal conflicts in the capital Istanbul. Manisa was a special sanjak, reserved for the heir to the throne. Young Prince Suleiman had been governing his province here in Manisa as the sole heir to the throne since 1509. He was still 20 years old, but he had already shown himself to be a mature, thoughtful, and talented administrator. Everyone knew that he would ascend the Ottoman throne after his father, Sultan Selim the Grim. He had no other rivals. His brothers had died in childhood. Suleiman, as the sole heir, was the future sultan. In his palace in Manisa, Suleiman had a harem. According to the customs of that period, princes and sultans would have multiple concubines. This was not just a matter of pleasure, but also a political necessity. Having multiple sons would guarantee the continuation of the dynasty. Prince Suleiman's harem also had approximately 20 concubines. In the mid-1510s, a concubine named Mahidevran was brought to this harem. Exactly where she came from is debatable. Some sources say Circassian, some Abkhazian, and some say Crimean Tatar origin. But in the 16th century, the concubine's origin wasn't that important. What mattered was what place she would establish in the palace, and whether she could win the sultan's or prince's heart. Mahidevran quickly distinguished herself from among the other concubines. She was beautiful, of course, that's certain. But there was more than beauty. She was intelligent, cultured, gracious. She managed to attract the young prince's attention. And over time, more than just physical attraction developed between them, a deep emotional bond. A real intimacy formed. Those days in Manisa Palace were perhaps the happiest period of Mahidevran's life. The prince was young and idealistic. He wasn't yet carrying the heavy burden of reign. There were state affairs, of course, but not as intense and complex as in Istanbul. In the evenings at sunset, Suleiman and Mahidevran could walk in the palace gardens. On spring evenings they could chat under the pergola. Suleiman would read her poems, Persian couplets, love poems. Mahidevran would play the oud and sing songs. There was no protocol between them, only love. Mahidevran rose from among the approximately 20 concubines to the position of Bashkadun, or Haseki, the chief consort. This wasn't just a title. It meant being the prince's most beloved, most trusted woman. Now the administration of the harem was in Mahidevran's hands. The other concubines showed her respect and obeyed her orders. And in May of 1515, the most precious fruit of this union was born, Prince Mustafa. The birth of a son meant everything for a concubine in the Ottoman order. Mahidevran was no longer just a beloved woman, but a prince's mother. She had received the title of Valide, and in Ottoman tradition, being a prince's mother gave a woman both tremendous power and great responsibility. Her position changed overnight. Now her word was heard in the palace. She moved to private quarters. The number of her servants increased. Her income rose. But most importantly, her future was secured, because her son Mustafa was Prince Suleiman's first son. And in Ottoman tradition, usually the eldest prince ascended the throne. This meant that when Suleiman became sultan one day, Mustafa would be his heir as the eldest son. And when Mustafa became sultan, Mahidevran would be Valide Sultan, the most powerful woman of the empire. Mahidevran, with this awareness, devoted herself entirely to her son's education and upbringing. The best tutors were hired for little Mustafa. The prince began taking Arabic and Persian lessons when he was only 5 years old. Hafiz teachers were brought to memorize the Quran. History, geography, mathematics lessons were given. But Mahidevran wasn't only concerned with academic education. She gave special importance to character education for her son. She constantly talked to him about justice. "One day you will rule this great empire," she would say. "You must be just in the eyes of the people. A sultan who oppresses loses value in his people's eyes, but a just sultan protects his throne eternally." She taught him mercy. Always help the powerless, the poor, the orphans, the widows. She taught him generosity. Wealth multiplies when shared, but molds when hoarded. And little Mustafa absorbed all these teachings. He was an intelligent child. He loved learning from books and knew how to listen to people. His teachers admired him. "This child will be a great sultan," they would say among themselves. Prince Suleiman was also closely involved with his son. It was his father who gave Mustafa his first sword. When he was 5 years old, with a small sword, he taught him how to wear it during ceremonies. He taught him horseback riding. They started with a small pony in the palace gardens, then moved on to big horses. He taught him archery. They set up target boards, and Mustafa tried to draw the bow with his small fingers. His father was proud of every success. There was a very strong bond between father and son. Suleiman saw himself in Mustafa, the same seriousness, the same thoughtfulness, the same sense of responsibility. In the evenings when Suleiman came home tired from state affairs, little Mustafa would run to him and hug him. Suleiman would take his son in his arms, stroke his hair and ask, "How are you, my son? What did you learn today?" Mustafa would excitedly tell him which lesson he attended, what he learned, what his teachers said. Mahidevran would watch these scenes, and her heart would fill with peace. She could see how bright the future was. Her husband would become sultan one day, and her son would ascend the throne after him. Everything seemed perfect. Her life was like a fairy tale, and she believed in the happy ending of this fairy tale. These peaceful, happy days in Manisa lasted 7 years. For 7 years, Mahidevran lived beside Suleiman, watching her son Mustafa grow. But in September 1520, everything changed. Sultan Selim the Grim fell ill on his return from campaign. In Damascus, then in Korlu, his condition worsened, and on September 22nd, he passed away at the age of 49. When the news reached Manisa, so did the reality that Suleiman was now sultan. Prince Suleiman was now Sultan Suleiman. Young but strong and determined, Suleiman immediately set off for Istanbul. The family, the harem, everyone departed with their entire retinue. After a journey lasting days, they arrived in Istanbul, this magnificent city considered the center of the world, at Topkapi Palace. Istanbul, one of the greatest cities history has seen, hundreds of thousands of people, dozens of mosques, baths, bazaars, market, a magnificent capital spread across both sides of the Bosphorus, and Topkapi Palace. This palace, where Selim, where Fatih, where so many sultans had sat, was now home to Suleiman and his family. But for Mahidevran, this new life brought unexpected difficulties. Manisa's warm, intimate, almost familial atmosphere gave way to cold, rigid hierarchical palace protocol. Everything was different now. Everything was more formal, more distant, more complex. Suleiman was no longer just Mahidevran's husband. He was the sultan of a vast empire spanning 3 continents, home to millions of people. There were divan meetings every morning, meetings with viziers, pashas, military commanders. Ambassadors would come and be received. Campaigns were planned. Taxes, laws, treaties, everything passed through the sultan's approval. Suleiman had a tremendous burden on his shoulders, and this burden left very little time for private life. Mahidevran was also no longer just a beloved woman, just the prince's favorite. She had an official position, prince's mother. She wasn't yet Valid Sultan, because Suleiman's mother, Hafsa Sultan, was alive and held the Valid Sultan title, but it was still an important position. Mahidevran had serious responsibilities in the harem, maintaining discipline, supervising personnel, overseeing the education of young concubines, resolving minor disputes within the harem, participating in ceremonies. Her duty was no longer emotional, but entirely official and administrative. Mahidevran was a manager, like a bureaucrat. In Manisa, they could sit in the garden until late at night, watch the stars and chat. Now she could only meet at certain times, within protocol rules, only when the sultan called. In Manisa, she could sit comfortably beside Suleiman, laugh, joke around. Now she had to comply with the palace's strict hierarchical order, observe courtesy rules, keep her distance. This coldness, this distance, this formality was very difficult for Mahidevran, but what could she do? She had to accept it. This was the price of being the sultan's consort. Her role now came from order, not from the heart. She was now part of the state, not of the heart, and precisely during this period, in the second year of Suleiman's reign, in 1521, a new young concubine was brought to the palace. Her name was Alexandra, a girl of Russian or Ukrainian origin, 15 or 16 years old. Historians don't know exactly where she came from, perhaps captured during a raid, perhaps sold by slave traders. But the result was the same. Young Alexandra found herself in the harem of Topkapi Palace. Mahidevran didn't pay much attention to this at first. After all, new concubines were constantly coming to the harem. New girls would be brought every month, every week. They would be trained, learn their harem duties, and perhaps some might catch the sultan's attention, or perhaps not. Mahidevran was now experienced, confident. She was a prince's mother. She had power. A new young girl couldn't threaten her. But very soon she realized that things weren't as she thought. Alexandra, or Hurrem as she was named by the sultan, was an extraordinary woman. Yes, she was beautiful. With her red hair, green eyes, and fair skin, she had a striking beauty. But there were many beautiful concubines in the harem. Hurrem had other talents. She was cheerful, very cheerful. She would constantly smile and make those around her laugh. She was intelligent. She learned languages quickly and began speaking Turkish fluently in a short time. She was talkative, knew how to communicate, and most importantly, she was very good at understanding people. When Suleiman came home tired from state affairs, when he was restless thinking about heavy state matters, Hurrem knew how to relax him. She would sing songs for him. She would tell funny stories. She would play chess with him. Suleiman loved the game of chess. Sometimes she would deliberately lose so the sultan would win and be pleased. And sometimes she would play really well and surprise the sultan. In the Manisa years, Suleiman's emotions were in the background. At that time he was still young, full of idealism. Statesmanship came first. But with Hurrem's arrival, this balance was broken. The sultan, approaching 40, fell in love again, and this time, this love was completely different. It was a more intense, more passionate, deeper love. Suleiman gave her the name Hurrem. In Persian it meant cheerful, joyful, one who brings happiness. This name wasn't given in vain. Hurrem truly made Suleiman happy. In her presence, the sultan would relax, laugh, and forget about heavy state affairs. Hurrem rose very quickly. Within months, she gained a special place in Suleiman's eyes. In 1521, she gave birth to her first son, Mehmed. The sultan was very happy. Another son. This was important for the continuation of the dynasty. Then in 1522, her second son Abdullah was born, but he died at a young age. Then came Selim in 1524, Bayezid in 1525, Cihangir in 1530. Hurrem gave birth to 5 sons and 1 daughter, Mahidevran Sultan. Everyone in the palace had noticed by now, the most influential woman was Hurrem. The sultan loved her very much. He listened to her words, asked her opinion. Hurrem acted wisely, never going to extremes but knowing how to use her influence. And this situation naturally created serious, increasingly growing tension between her and Mahidevran. A silent but deep rivalry began between the two women. Mahidevran had a strong card in her hand, Mustafa. She was the mother of the Sultan's first son. Mustafa was now 10 years old, a handsome, intelligent child. According to Ottoman tradition, the eldest prince usually ascended the throne. This was a guarantee for Mahidevran, but Hurrem didn't sit idle either. She was thinking about her own son's future, and her place in Suleiman's heart gave her a great advantage. This cold war between the two women gradually turned into more open hostility. There was constant tension in the harem. Mahidevran was trying to protect her former position, while Hurrem was rising rapidly. Servants, eunuchs, other concubines, everyone was aware of this rivalry. Sides had become clear, and one day, exactly when is not known, but probably in the early 1530s, a violent argument occurred between the two women. According to accounts, perhaps during a ceremony, perhaps at a harem meeting, a fight broke out. Mahidevran and Hurrem argued, and Mahidevran, succumbing to her anger, physically assaulted Hurrem. Some sources say that Mahidevran scratched Hurrem's face, pulled her hair, and slapped her. Hurrem's face was left with scratches, her eye was bruised. The details of this incident are not exactly known. Perhaps it was exaggerated, or perhaps on the contrary, downplayed. But the results were clear. When Suleiman heard about the incident, he became very angry. The Sultan was angry with Mahidevran. He scolded her. "How can such a thing happen? To assault a concubine, this is unworthy of this palace," he said. Mahidevran tried to defend herself, but Suleiman wouldn't listen. He grew cold toward her. They were already spending very little time together. Now the distance increased even more. This incident caused the already weakened bond between them to completely break. Suleiman now barely met with Mahidevran. He spent all his time with Hurrem, and then Suleiman took a historic step. A step that was unprecedented in 6 centuries of Ottoman history, something without parallel. In 1534, he married Hurrem. He performed an official marriage ceremony. He made her legally his wife, a free woman. This was a tremendous break. Ottoman sultans did not marry. Why? Because marriage would give power to the woman. A wife would have legal rights. A concubine, on the other hand, was more controllable, could be dismissed at will, and held a position with limited power. Sultans did not want to share power. That's why for centuries they only lived with concubines. But Suleiman, because of his love for Hurrem, broke this tradition. He made her his wife through marriage. Now Hurrem held not just the title Sultan, but Haseki Hurrem Sultan, a title meaning legal wife. For the first time in history, a sultan had married his concubine. This event was a complete disaster for Mahidevran. There was no going back now, no hope left. She had been completely erased from Suleiman's life. She had lost the Haseki title. Now only her position as prince's mother remained. But Mahidevran didn't give up. Setting aside her own feelings, her own disappointment, her own pain, she focused all her energy on her son. "I must protect Mustafa's future," she told herself. "He will ascend the throne. He will become sultan. Then I will become Valide Sultan. My waiting, my patience will be rewarded." She remained loyal to tradition. She continued her duties in the harem. She participated in ceremonies. She made no complaints. But her heart was broken, her spirit wounded. At night she would cry alone in her room, and in the morning she would try to reduce the swelling of her eyes with cold water. Years passed. Mustafa grew up. From 10 to 15 years old, from 15 to 20, he was becoming a handsome, charismatic, extremely intelligent young man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, imposing like his father, but at the same time, he was merciful, just, someone who thought of the people. According to Ottoman tradition, when princes reached a certain age, usually 15 or 16, they would be sent to provinces as governors. This was an educational process. The prince would learn governance here, gain experience, lead his army, establish relationships with the people. At the same time, this was a method to keep princes away from the capital and prevent potential fraternal conflicts. In 1533, 18-year-old Mustafa was first sent as governor to Manisa. Later, in 1541, he was appointed to Amasya, and according to Ottoman tradition, the prince's mother would also go with her son. As the head of his harem, Mahidevran left Istanbul with Mustafa. She was now away from Hurrem, from the palace, from the intrigues. In a way, perhaps she was relieved. She was now with her son. She could see him every day. But at the same time, she had also distanced herself from central power. She couldn't see what was happening in Istanbul, what plans Hurrem was making. In Amasya, Mahidevran continued to contribute to her son's education and governance. She participated in Mustafa's councils, advising him. When they went among the people, she was by his side. She organized aid distributions to the poor, and Mustafa grew and became known as exactly the perfect prince his mother had hoped for. Historical sources, both Ottoman and foreign writers, speak admiringly of Mustafa. They call him charismatic, just, generous, knowledgeable, brave. The people loved him. Villagers, merchants, religious scholars, everyone was pleased with Mustafa. "This is our future sultan," they would say. "May God grant him long life. After his father dies, he will ascend the throne." His soldiers worshipped him, especially the Janissaries, the Ottoman army's most elite unit, loved Mustafa very much. They had seen Mustafa's courage in campaigns. They knew he was a fair commander. "Mustafa Celebi," they would shout to him. With every victory, with every just decision, Mustafa's reputation grew even more. When Mahidevran heard these things, she felt proud. Yes, she would say to herself, "My son will be a great sultan. All these pains, all these humiliations will be worth it. I will wait, I will see that day." But this growing reputation was also creating great danger, because there was a rule in the Ottoman system, an unwritten but universally known rule. Only one prince could ascend the throne. The others, the fate of the others was dark, either exile or death. Over time, rivalry among the princes began to intensify. Mustafa was growing stronger. Hurrem's sons, Mehmed, Selim, Bayezid, had also grown up, and they too had been sent as governors to provinces. And in Istanbul, in the palace, intrigues began to turn. Constant letters, reports were coming to the Sultan. "Mustafa is growing too powerful. The people love him too much. The Janissaries are loyal to him, not to you." Some of these reports were true, some were exaggerated, and some were completely fabricated. Some historians claim that Hurrem and her son-in-law, Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, Hurrem's daughter Mihrimah's husband, constantly whispered words against Mustafa in Suleiman's ear. "Mustafa is preparing a rebellion. The Janissaries are gathering around him. He wants to overthrow you and become sultan himself." How much of this is true, how much is conspiracy, is not known for certain. Perhaps Hurrem really made such plans, or perhaps it was just the natural flow of events. But the result was clear. Suleiman had begun to have doubts about Mustafa. The Sultan, approaching 60, was no longer thinking like a father but like a sovereign. The survival of the state, the future of the dynasty, the security of the throne, these were more important than anything. And if Mustafa really posed a threat, that threat needed to be eliminated. In the autumn of 1553, the Ottoman army went on campaign against Iranian Shah Topkapi. Suleiman personally led the army. The army passed through Anatolia and came to the Konya plains, near Eregli, and at precisely this moment, an order came to Mustafa. "Come to your father's presence. The Sultan calls you to meet." Mustafa set out from Amasya, but those around him were worried. His loyal men, his advisors warned him. "Don't go, my lord," they said. "This could be a trap. Hurrem and Rustem Pasha may have plotted a conspiracy. You're not safe," they said. But Mustafa didn't listen to these warnings. "My father is calling me," he said. "I cannot disobey the Sultan. How can I not go? He is my father, my Sultan. Going is my duty." Perhaps deep down, he believed his father couldn't do him harm. Perhaps he was truly innocent, truly had no rebellion plan. His loyal men warned him one last time. "My lord, please go, but take armed men with you. Protect yourself." But Mustafa refused this too. "No," he said. "Am I to go to my father's presence with armed men? That would be disrespectful. I will go alone." It was October 6, 1553. Mustafa came to the Sultan's camp with a small retinue, only a few servants and advisors. When the Janissaries saw him, they began to applaud wildly. Thousands of soldiers were shouting, "Long live our prince, Mustafa Celebi, our future sultan." This scene was also being watched from Suleiman's tent. The curtains were slightly open. The Sultan was watching. He saw the soldiers' love for Mustafa, their loyalty. And perhaps this scene removed the last doubts in Suleiman's mind, caused him to make his final decision. Mustafa walked toward the Sultan's tent. He wore a white kaftan. He had his turban on his head. He was 38 years old, in the spring of his life. He entered through the tent door, to greet his father, to bow, to kiss his hand. But Suleiman wasn't in the tent. He was behind the curtain, not seeing his son, not wanting to see him. In the tent were 7 executioners, deaf and mute executioners, men specially prepared by Suleiman's order. A silk bowstring was ready. When Mustafa entered, for a moment he didn't understand what was happening. Then he saw the executioners, and he understood. His eyes widened with fear and disbelief. "No," he said, "Father, I'm innocent." But the executioners had already come at him. Mustafa resisted. He was a strong, athletic man. He pushed 2 or 3 executioners aside. He grabbed onto the tent pole. But what could he do alone against 7? Finally, they overcame him. They put the silk bowstring around his neck. They tightened it. Mustafa began to suffocate. He couldn't breathe. He struggled, and finally became motionless. Behind the curtain, before his own father's eyes, Prince Mustafa lost his life. At 38 years old, still in the spring of his life, accused of treason. This is an event that historians call one of the most tragic moments in Ottoman history. For 6 centuries, much pain was experienced, much blood was shed, but Mustafa's death holds a special place, because everyone loved Mustafa, everyone knew he was innocent, and everyone felt that this was a terrible injustice. When the news spread through the army, soldiers cried, janissaries shouted, and rioted. Rebellion broke out. Several viziers were killed, but ultimately, the Sultan's order had been carried out. There was no going back. When the news reached Amasya, to Mahidevran, the woman's world collapsed. Her son, her little Mustafa, the son whose first steps had made her rejoice, whose first words had made her cry, for whose school start she had prayed, the only meaning of her life, all her hopes, all her dreams for the future. Mahidevran screamed. She tore at her hair. The composure she had maintained for years, her dignified manner, collapsed in an instant. She was suffering as a mother. She was experiencing the deepest, most helpless pain. For days she didn't eat. For days she didn't sleep. She only cried. Cried. Her servants became worried. Doctors were called. But Mahidevran listened to no one. "My son," she would only say. "My Mustafa." Then Mustafa's body was brought to Bursa. It was ordered that a tomb be built in the Mouradiye complex. Mahidevran also went to Bursa. She attended the funeral ceremony. Thousands of people had come. The people were crying. "Our prince," they shouted. "He was wronged." Mustafa was buried in Mouradiye. A magnificent tomb was built of white marble, and Mahidevran settled in a modest house right next to the tomb. Now she had only one purpose in life, to keep her son's memory alive, to visit the tomb every day, to have prayers recited, to give alms to the poor, and to wait for death. Every morning when she woke up, the first thing she did was open the window and look at her son's tomb. "Good morning, my son," she would say quietly. Then she would perform ablution, pray, and go to the tomb. She would sit for hours in the tomb and pray. Sometimes she would talk to her son. "My Mustafa," she would say, "you were wronged, you were innocent, you were pure, but God will see. God is just." Sometimes she would tell about the past, the days in Manisa, Mustafa's childhood. "Do you remember, my son, how we laughed when you fell off the horse the first time you rode?" she would say. "Do you remember how happy you were when you received your first sword from your father?" Her financial situation was also very bad. Her salary tied to the palace had been cut, because her son had been declared a traitor. Mahidevran's income was also cut. She struggled very much at times. In some periods she survived on just bread and water, but she never complained. She maintained her dignity. In 1558, Hurrem died. What did Mahidevran feel when she heard this? I wonder, joy, sadness, or just emptiness? It's not known. But one thing didn't change. Mahidevran continued to live in the house next to the tomb, still in the same routine. In 1566, 13 years later, Suleiman also died. At the siege of Sigetvar Castle, he passed away in his tent. He was 72 years old. He had reigned for 46 years. He would be called Kanuni, the lawgiver. But he would go down in history as Suleiman the Magnificent. After Suleiman's death, Hurrem's son Selim ascended the throne. Selim II, who would be known in history as Selim the Sot. When Selim ascended the throne, perhaps wanting to fulfill his mother's will, or just as a matter of protocol, he showed respect to Mahidevran. He restored her cut salary. He provided financial assistance. Mahidevran's financial situation improved somewhat. She no longer struggled to make ends meet. But her spirit, her heart was still broken. She was still mourning her son. Years passed. Mahidevran grew old. Her hair turned white, her back bent, her hands began to tremble. But every morning, every day, she continued to go to the tomb. As she aged, walking became difficult. She began using a cane, but she still went. On a winter day in 1581, at around 90 years old, some sources say 80, Mahidevran Sultan passed away quietly, peacefully in her house in Bursa. Her death brought no pain. She simply slept and didn't wake up. Her will was fulfilled. She was buried next to her son. Right beside Prince Mustafa's tomb, Mahidevran Sultan's grave still stands today. White marble, a simple tombstone, only her name and date of death inscribed on it. Today, 5 centuries later, Mahidevran Sultan is remembered in history books as an unfortunate sultan. Some call her Bedbot Mahidevran, unlucky, unfortunate Mahidevran. This description actually summarizes many things: a life that rose high, approached the peak, then fell to the very bottom. Love, power, hope. She experienced all of them, lost all of them. She underwent a heavy trial. She experienced a bitter end. But perhaps the best way to describe Mahidevran is this: a mother, just a mother. A mother who loved her son, was devoted to him, thought of him above all else. She experienced the glory of palaces, but in the end gave it up. She had power, wealth, prestige, then lost it all. But she never, ever lost her love for her son. Today in Bursa, in the quiet garden of the Muradia complex, among marble tombstones and prayers, in the shade of plane trees, Mahidevran Sultan lies beside her son. 2 graves, side by side, mother and son. They were separated in life, reunited in death, together forever. And perhaps, after all those pains, all those losses, all those disappointments, this was the only real consolation for Mahidevran, to be beside her son, forever,